This video is part of an educational series that talks about how to configure OutsideView Enterprise. In this video, you will learn how to configure the SQL Server 2005 for use with OutsideView. The intended audience is for IT or SQL administrators or supervisors. The requirements are admin rights and SQL or SQL Express 2005 version or later. You will first need to launch the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio tool. This tool allows you to connect to the SQL Server 2005 and make your changes. In SQL Server 2005, users have limited permissions to access the database and perform operations on them. Even with Windows authentication, the database administrator will need to configure the security aspect of the database once the license pool database is installed. For instance, the default behavior for users allow them to connect to the database but not perform other functions, such as writing to the database or reading from the database. To resolve this in a Windows authentication environment, the database administrator will need to create a domain group in which all the users that need to use the database are added to that group. For example, in our environment, we have a domain group called CP Testing that is already created. In this group, all the users that belong in the CP Testing area are added to this domain. Then in the SQL Server Management tool, the domain group is added by selecting the logins folder and right-clicking it to launch the command new login. A login panel will appear and you will need to enter the domain group, or as an alternative, search for the group and enter the name into the login name text box. Since we already have one created, we will just type it into here. Then in the default database, set the value to point to the license pool database that was created during the Enterprise install. So for us, we will be pointing to Crystal Point License Pool. After entering the login name, you will need to configure the user mapping. This option allows us to map the role membership for the domain group to a specific database. For this example, the database we're mapping to is Crystal Point License Pool. And the database role membership for Crystal Point License Pool should be checkmarked for DB Data Reader, DB Data Writer, and Public. This gives us the ability to connect to the Crystal Point License Pool database so that we can read and write to it. After configuring the login name, you will need to configure the property for one of the store procedure called OVSP_release license. Expand the license pool database and find the folder icon for programmability. In our example, our license pool database is Crystal Point License Pool. And expand the folder for programmability. Find the store procedure and expand that. Under the store procedures folder, there is a procedure name, dbo.ovsp_release license. Highlight that, right-click the mouse button, and select Properties. The stored procedure properties OVSP_release license dialog box should come up. In the Select a Page column, select the page for permissions. Now in the right hand side of this panel, there is a region for users or roles. This is currently empty. Click on the Add button. This will bring up the Select Users or Roles dialog box. In the lower half of that dialog box, type in the value Public. And click on the OK button. This will place the role Public into the Users or Roles list box, right here. Now in the explicit permissions for Public, you will see some values there. In the row for Execute, go into the column for Grant and checkmark that value. Finally, click on the OK button. This will have configured this store procedure and expose it so that it can be called. Your license pool database is now ready to be used. This concludes the video on configuring SQL Server 2005 for use with the OutsideView Enterprise.